sorry, so just going back to what I was saying is, the process of human resource planning, which is nothing but the identification of, the current and future needs of the organization to achieve its goal, is something which the HR department starts to do even before the process of recruitment, actually starts. So planning for them is actually a link between, the management of resources, which is in particular people, and also the overall achievement of the organizational goal in terms of, say, a plan, say a business plan. And at some stage, they look at basically, then reviewing the process through, evaluation techniques or performance management techniques to try and see the goal which was set up and for which the resources have been recruited. Are they in line? Are they matching? And are they able to provide that output which is required, under this process? So some of the points which basically are on the slide, things like HR programs to enhance overall organizational performance. Now, these are areas wherein the HR then starts to plan that if we have recruited somebody on board, which probably needs, a resource, a person needs training on maybe a certain piece of software, for example, which could make that person much more effective and efficient in doing its daily job, then the HR's role is to basically try and, protect that gap area in the skill, and then, budget in for the, programs or trainings which will enhance the performance of that individual. Now, in some cases, what tends to happen is that the HR, because of the change happening, the strategic change happening within the organization, will plan this in advance, because they need not just ad hoc budget, but a fixed budget to be able to train a number of employees or a range of employees across the organization to fit better or, to cope better with that particular change. And this process, an example I would give you is, in all businesses and in all organizations, we tend to see this process happening every 3, 4, 5 years. Is that, say, an example which I normally use is when you look at offices moving from Windows XP to Windows 7, from Windows 7 to, say, Windows 10. Now, in most cases, employees are able to adapt, but in some cases, employees need to be trained to be able to use the software much more effectively when there is a significant change happening. So this is something which is a part of human resources planning. The organization, within the organization, the HR starts to look at, because it is more of a strategic shift. Like a lot of organizations have now shifted to using tablets and, touch screens within the office. So this is a strategic shift. Most employees might not need training, but in most cases, the HR looks at changeover from a strategic planning point of view, because they have to introduce policies and procedures which match the new kind of technology coming in, like the tablet or, a mobile device, which is as against the static device, which was a PC in the organizations earlier. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
So things like changes to their policies of data protection, the use of Wi-Fi, use of content within the office, things like that. And this was a big change then when we looked at that more organizations kind of shifted to fiber, 10 years back in terms of broadband and internet usage. Most office usage predominantly was just email based, but when it moved to, file and data sharing within organizations, and when fiber started to become available, there was a strategic shift wherein most of the HR departments rewrote these related to usage of IT within the organization. So similarly, you look at, the human resources department looks at this process of HRP more proactively if there is a bigger decision or a big change happening within the organization. The other bits that we look at is, in some cases, this is an important, we are seeing at least in our generational shift of working within the organization, is that the organizations look at redesigning the workplace. Do you understand what do I mean by redesigning the workplace?
Restructure.
That is correct. So here the idea of flexible working comes into place, because most now introduced policies which allow, a greater role, things like paternity leave, both for both parents. Maternity is for mothers, but paternity for fathers. They also look at flexible, work policies in particular. In some cases, some organizations which are internet-led businesses or internet economies like the Facebook, Google, Amazon, eBay, LinkedIn, they have a lot of reorganization which has happened within the office space to try and suit, the employees' working, environment to make it more productive, because their kind of work is not physical work, but it is much more to do with, either programming or mental work with regards to their organizational requirements. And last but not the least, you normally see that a lot of organizations do, surveys. And in these surveys, one of the surveys which the HR does across the year is to look at financial benchmarks in terms of salary and wage levels. And some of the activities then are classified that, okay, this particular activity, like when you look at business and sales development, is classed at this level, and they benchmark with organizations in the market to try and have the same wage and salary, have it at least attractive enough to retain the talent within the organization. Okay. Right? Now, next thing that we look at, when the process of the planning actually has started, now what we want to be able to look at is what all does the planning take into account, and what are the factors which actually affect that planning as a. So when you look at HR, every organization, every department within the organization, whether it's sales, marketing, operations, engineering, production, finance, HR, they all do their annual planning exercises at some point in time, right? Yeah. Now, the HR department in general looks at these, it is affected by these kind of factors. So it could be affected by external factors. It could be affected by the overall business strategy which the organization or the management is trying to put in place. The number of employees within the organization could affect the HR strategy, the other way around. Sometimes the HR strategy also takes, clues from, and they try and recruit people in order to develop a certain type of corporate culture within the organization. And I'll give an example. In some cases, when you draw up the HR strategy or the planning, which is done on an annual basis, also looks at building competitive advantages and how does that strategy help differentiate the people working within the organization from others. And the last but not the least, the roles at some point in time within different, organization, when HR department, within the HR, there are different roles. So sometimes the organization looks at expanding on its own roles within the department, and that could be that the payroll, for example, the number of employees in the organization have exceeded so much that there is now a specific need to create a payroll department within the HR. There is a need to create the pensions department within the HR department. There is a department for training and development that needs to be created. So sometimes roles are also looked at in particular to try and cope with the demand of the growth in the organization, and accordingly a strategy is put in place. Now, very briefly, looking at some of the examples of how these then affect, the HR planning in particular. So when you look at external market, external market could be that if there is the economy is growing well, or if the economy has, there's recession setting in, then you will normally see the HR starts preparing a list of people to be made redundant, or there are layoffs which happen, or they try and squeeze down on budgets and costs wherever possible. Correct? When you look at business strategy, sometimes the HR department or the planning process is asked and create a resource plan basis the growth and requirement needs of the business. So sometimes what happens is the managing director or the chief executive will sit with the HR in particular and give them a guideline that, okay, I'm expecting the business to grow 20% this year, 50% next year, and 100% a year after. So can you put a resource plan in place, keeping in mind this overall business strategy? And that is where the HR planning essentially sits down to not look at just resource planning from a point of view of how many heads are required or people are required to be recruited, but also from a perspective of what is going to be the financial outlay, which the salaries and the other perks and incentives will be required to support that structure in the organization in the long run. And that is done something from a business strategic perspective. When you look at employees, it's the other way around. Now, sometimes the HR does reviews across the year to try and see what are the best positions which can be offered to employees because they have outgrown their role, or maybe they have, you know, they might have a fear of losing that employee to a competitor because the employee is performing quite well, and obviously, there are other organizations which would want to kind of poach the employee from within the organization because he's a star performer, or there is a need for that particular talent. And in the case of corporate culture, you look at things wherein, when you look at the financial market in particular, the banking, financial and the banking sector, you normally, there's a certain kind of corporate culture. Or when you look at the solicitors market, the legal market, legal services side of market, you will see that there's a kind of a prevalent corporate culture within the organization. And sometimes when the planning is done keeping in mind the culture of the organization. They want to bring in somebody who's generally, well versed with the process, well versed with the industry, is able to jumpstart in his or her role. And last but not the least, they need to have certain type of prerequisite qualifications before they are recruited. Now, if you are going out as a partnership firm or as a legal firm, if you are going out to recruit somebody, now would you recruit somebody who's not having a valid, say, legal qualification? If you are a firm of barristers or lawyers, would you recruit somebody to work within the organization from a perspective of going to courts and looking at attendance and all that stuff? Would you recruit a non-barrister or somebody who's not qualified as a lawyer?
It depends. The answer would be no, but
yeah, it depends. I agree. Overall, when you look at, if they're expanding, they want to expand, maybe say they're offering commercial law, family law, immigration, but if they're adding a law, a different form of law, say for example, mortgages or things like that, they would normally get a lawyer in who understands that side of things, isn't it?
Yes.
Similarly, obviously there could be expansion in terms of administration and support required, but in general, if you look at the majority of the business, majority of the employees within that specialist business, they're to try and recruit somebody who's coming across from that background and that culture, which can immediately start work and jumpstart the organization as far as that strategy is concerned.
Yeah.
Right? Now let's look at, you've heard about 4 P's of marketing, isn't it?
Not 4 P's.
About 4 P's of change management, or 4 P's in HR in particular.
I think I might have learnt that like years ago.
Right. Okay.
I know about change management.
Yeah.
But vaguely can remember something about the 4 P's.
Right. So basically what happens is, sometimes when the human resources planning looks at across a staff change within the organization, that means they are going to be deviating from the usual or the norm in the organization. What tends to happen is they go through a process of something called change management. And change management is nothing but, if I have to define change management, it is nothing but maybe a process or an approach which the human resources department has to adopt in order for the individuals to successfully transition from one role or one type of function they perform within the organization to kind of meet and kind of redirect them to helping them upgrade their skills to perform another function within the organization. So here the approach is primarily changes which are required to be brought across in the individuals or human as a resource, not humans, human as a resource, people as a resource, so that the organization is able to redirect its energies and resources, budgets, in terms of better utilization because of change of technology, or maybe because of the change in the marketplace. Right?
Yeah.
So here, when we look at change management, there are, basically 4 roles or 4 P's which basically look at change management. The first P is purpose. Why do you think such a drastic change is required to be done? And that needs to be identified as the first P, which is the purpose. Why is there a change happening? What is the background to the change? And last but not the least, what is it in for me? That means the individual going to be asked to undergo that particular process of change would always have that question of why is it me? Why is it me that needs to look at this change, or why is it me that has to kind of, look at performing, this particular change. The other is when you explain something like this in terms of that you're going to be undergoing a change and things like that, tends to is that you will then look at understanding what is the overall picture. Correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So in terms of greater, scheme of things to come. So here what you're looking at is that, basically any employee which has been asked to, adapt to this change looks at how are things going to change in the future. What are the risks and concerns, we need to look at, or he needs to look at in particular, focus on. Say, for example, the office relocation move would mean that if you're settled in London and obviously, you don't want to move out of London, if the office moves, even if it is giving you a promotion or your salary, you might not decide to move because of the risks and concerns that you might have with regards to family and a couple of other things related to that area. And then you might look at the overall picture and say, okay, it might be better off for me to kind of, move into a better, maybe move into a different role, or accept a different role within the organization, which allows me to stay back here rather than move, or travel to another premise once the office moves. Correct?
Yeah.
The third P is planning. So you always time yourself to understand what is the bigger plan. How long is it going to take for that change to happen? What is expected at the end of the change? And then once you're planning for this, you then break it down into smaller steps to try and see that, okay, once it has to be achieved, this can only be achieved with small steps taken in that direction. And in those cases, these small steps, what you do is you try and identify the key milestones, right? So in the case of office relocation, which is happening, which is a big change happening for a lot of staff working in the location, say London, when they look at that, there would be key milestones, which would mean that, okay, first thing would infrastructure would move. Second thing would be that the IT would move. Those are key milestones. Once the IT is installed, the infrastructure is ready, the desks and chairs and all that, and it is functional. The PCs are functional, the broadband internet, telephone lines are functional. That means a key milestone has been achieved, and then you would look at moving off the operations. That means first come first. Sometimes you will see that that they were moved from because of the fact that certain departments which are in the back-end operations would move first. Things like finance could move, but the sales would move in the last, for example, or the reception or the that department will move the first into the new premises. So it requires timeline to be set, expectations to be met, and key milestones to be achieved before the full transition can happen in this case of the office relocation. Last but not the least, we look at part, what is, it always comes to the fact, and it always comes down to the position wherein everybody looks at what is my part going to be during that change? What role am I expected to play in this particular change? And what is expected of me once that has been achieved? So if an organization hires, from a planning perspective, a project manager which will oversee this relocation of the office, at some stage, the project manager would come to a conclusion that, okay, once that project management, once that office relocation has happened, what is it going to be expected in terms of whether he will lose his job, whether he will get a new contract, or what is the further role the project manager is going to assume, is something that he will look at in particular. So overall, when you look at the process of change and change management, to happen, these are the 4 P's that we normally look at planning from that perspective. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, next one that we are looking at is there are a few models that we will study. There are 2 models in particular that we are going to look at. One is the change management model, which is called the change curve, and that is the Kubler-Ross 5-stage model. And the other one that we will study is something called the Lewin change model. Now, this particular model is why we study, because of the fact that we are looking at making sure that when human resources planning HRP happens, and in this case when there are requirements of forecasting, staff turnover and other things being done, the which is going to be implemented should be able to understand the trends and should be able to predict some of the trends which are going to happen. So if an office relocation is being planned, just continuing with that example, the HR department, in particular the human resource planning part which is being done, they would basically, even before making the announcement, and budget for this, that there are so many types of, so there is an X percentage of employees which might not be happy with the move and might end up leaving. Do you think such a probability would exist?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. It basically, the Levin's model basically talks about, the change actually happening in 3 steps. And the reason why it looks at happening in 3 steps is, what it says is, at some stage, the HRP looks at, from an outsider's perspective, the current situation, which is unfreeze. Then they look at the whole process of change. And then what they go back to the same position wherein it was running efficiently, because after a bit of adjustment, the process of change or the process of relocation will go back to its original location, which is nothing but refreeze. So it's like saying, if I have to get up, and say, for example, I have to go up, get up and get into the car and drive from Manchester to London. First things first, what I have to do is basically plan the process. And in that planning of the process, what I'm going to do is unfreeze a lot of things, my own assumptions, the time it will take to travel, depending on traffic and all that. So that position is basically unfreezing. And at some stage, when I'm driving down to London, during the whole process, that process will be basically nothing change. And when I reach London and I get into my own home, or whatever it is, the hotel, I go back into the state wherein I'm kind of looking at, okay, I'm come back, I've driven successfully down to London, and here, I've reached safely. So that process basically just, kind of reassures yourself, and you go back to doing your routine things, because you're in the office or you're at your home, again, doing the routine operations that you do on a daily, weekly basis.
Okay.
So the 3 stages that we normally see, the unfreeze is basically talking about things like determine what needs to change. So in the case of office location, when they are looking at making this as a proposal, even before the announcement is done, they look at various needs, why this change. Now, before this is done, this decision is taken, they have to have a buy-in from the management. Does the chief executive support this? Are there long-term gains in this? Now, once that happens, you have to get a buy-in or a support from the senior management to even start planning, for this change.
Okay.
If you have the buy-in, then what tends to happen is that you basically would look at explaining to them or putting together a rationale or, some sort of a document which clearly describes, which would be circulated maybe in the office, to talk about why there is a need for change. That we have outgrown this premises, the business has grown in the last 20 years. We need to look at new recruitment and resources available here. It could be government-related legislation, which would mean that there could be some sort of a business promotion which is happening, wherein it is financially more viable for the business to set up in that location. So those kind of things are prepared in that document, which basically states why is there a need for change. And last but not the least, even before this is announced, they do a small, discussion, maybe internally with, the line managers, department heads, to try and manage their doubts and concerns of why this is happening.
Okay.
So even before the CEO or the chief executive actually makes the announcement, what he does is, in this close group of, confidence, he will discuss that this change is being done and this planning is going to be put in place. the final outcome of this will be actually shared, or will be disclosed to all your staff and members, peers, colleagues, whatever it is, at a point in time when he's understood their concerns and doubts, and they have been included in the change planning which is being done. The actual process of change is nothing but where the communication happens to all the employees, dispels all the rumors in terms of the concerns or the doubts which people have or the employees have. In some cases, there are teams which then get formulated wherein within the department they will formulate a team which will say, okay, you will take the responsibility of moving this, you will take the additional charge of doing this, and they get the buy-in in general from the employees before this change happens. And refreeze it. When they anchor the changes into the culture, that means they've got everybody's buy-in to be able to get that office relocation started. They will look at the ways in tandem with HR to try and see that even after this change, there is not much employee turnover, or there are not many employees which still end up leaving the organization. And in order for this change to happen, the organization will facilitate a lot of support and training. That means they might bring in something into the policy that's saying, okay, if you are based in the London office and you have to travel frequently to that office, the office would provide you a car, or maybe provide you, some sort of an annual pass for the train.
Yeah.
Or they will cover your expenses. And in order to do this, they then look at the whole process of, making sure that we go back to the same original state of, a kind of an equilibrium before the office relocation process started. So there's harmony, after the relocation as well of the premises to a new location. Okay. So here the Levens model essentially just focuses on these 3 steps, and they've defined some of these steps as, unfreeze, change, and looking at, what you call, refreeze. Now, the second one that we look at is, the Kubler-Ross 5-stage model. And it is another model that we look at in terms of, relocation. But this is more from an aspect of understanding, more from an understanding of, the human resources perspective. That what it is that when somebody is undergoing change, or if there is a situation wherein employees are undergoing change because of changes in the office environment, here what tends to happen is that they go through 5 phases of change phase. And these 5 changes of, 5 phases of change basically start with denial. That means a lot of employees will be in denial. They know the office will never move. I think it's a very big move. It won't be even sanctioned. Then some of them go into a stage which is anger, saying that, okay, why is it being moved? We are happy here. There's lots of change which is going to happen, so this change is not required. Some of them go into a depression because they can't move to a new, start worrying about their job or what kind of role or responsibility will be given because they have family and other things. And then some of them come to a stage wherein they say this is going to happen, it's imminent, but what they do is they basically start to prepare for a bargaining phase. That means they will start discussing with HR, maybe start looking out for jobs outwards and try and see if they can make it here rather than having to move on the other side. And the last stage is when it comes to a fact wherein, because a lot of rumors, gossips, concerns have been addressed, they come to a stage wherein they try and accept that, okay, the relocation is a good move. Overall, the company is looking at moving. They're trying to retain us. There are additional perks and incentives being given so that we can facilitate travel, things like that. And then it comes to a stage wherein they start to accept that change.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
2 different models looking at 2 different aspects of change management. One from a perspective of looking at physical more than human resources. The other looking at it from a point of view of just what the human resources go through and how people adapt to when they look at understanding change happening, which affects their direct working environment. Okay?
Okay.
Now, some of the next few slides which are put together are primarily looking at, understanding the contribution of HR in particular to the organization. So what I've done is I've put together quotes wherein it says, though a lot of people assume that HR departments, sometimes what you do is you get into a conversation and, it comes across that, the HR and finance roles are not very stressful. They are easygoing roles, and, that department is a support department and they do not have that kind of importance as compared to other types of departments within the organization. So when you look at the car manufacturing industry, the engineering, the production, the product development department may be the most important department in the outward nature of employees when they look at outwards from within the organization. But one of the key aspects which we forget is once again. One of the key aspects that we understand, which we don't understand, is that within that department, because the organizational setup is so large, if you do not have proper management of human resources and proper management of resources being provided to workers, then that whole operations would actually collapse. If the salaries are not processed on time, if proper working environment is not, or if proper training and development is not provided, all these are essential functions which also put a continuous pressure on HR and HR planning from a resource perspective. Do you understand that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so because in order to understand this, what also happens is that there are lots of ethical practices also built in to the working of this particular department. And the reason why this is done is that it is one of the, I think the example which I'll give you here is, a lot of organizations have something called the public liability insurance.
Yeah.
Or employer's liability insurance. Now, why do you think this is something which most organizations have beyond a certain size of business?
Well, every organization should have public liability insurance if they're dealing directly with the public. Like if there's sorry,
Go
if something were to happen now, like say a member of the public was to walk in and they injure themselves, then the organisation will need that public liability insurance because that member of the public can make a claim. So it's just to cover like the members of the public really, if there's any injuries or accidents, anything like that. And it's the same with employee liability insurance as well. It's to protect the employees.
That's absolutely correct. So basically, when you look at liability, it would be because of any physical resource, working environment, health and safety within the organization. If the employee or anybody else, in the event of having an injury or maybe an adverse effect, would be able to make that provision of making a claim, and that will be settled through that particular insurance policy which the organization has. But that remit of that particular function sits with human resources planning or human resources department in the practical sense. Because, for example, when you look at a lot of people who do highway maintenance, when they have to dig roads or dig up things, they end up developing some sort of a disorder which is related to at some stage shaking of hands. Now in those cases, or if they become their hearing, they over a point in time lose out on you basically lose the ability to be able to hear well. It's because they work with heavy machinery wherein there's a lot of noise and other things. So the general idea there is that policy covers it, but it is essentially the role of human resources department in terms of planning to foresee this proactively, that if these are the kind of functions which the employees are expected to do, then in their development and in the planning and the implementation stages, they need to be able to have these policies and practices in place or the ethical principles in place so that it works in the favor of the employees and in favor of the organization. a simple example of this is there is a 48-hour, maximum contract which is applicable in the case of, or a number of restriction on the number of flying hours for pilots in particular, right? A pilot cannot fly more than 48 hours a week. The reason this has been put in place is affects the person's ability to make judgment and perform the duties well if they are flying for more than these hours, or GP in the case of working GP surgeries beyond 48 hours, because it is physically considered unethical. One, it is physically considered unethical, and second, it puts a lot of strain on the employees to work those many hours because their job involves critical functions on which a lot of other things depend. So the insurance policy or the liability insurance is primarily taken out, as an insurance policy against the, say for example, errors, or against, let's put it this way, something which happens because of an incident. But in general, the human resource department has a very key responsibility wherein they are continuously under pressure to have these policies put in place which overall protects and safeguards the working of the individual within the organization. If that makes sense. Can you relate to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if we consider the ethical issues, what are the ethical issues then? So ethical issues which the organization works with or deals with within the department, which HR is responsible for, they look at these 6 responsibilities. So they look at, they have to ensure that there is diversity and equal opportunities provided to everybody, one and all within the organization. We hear about this, pay gap between women and in organizations. So HR department is coming under increasing pressure to be able to pick these gaps up and ensure that the women and men are paid at equal levels and they're rewarded equally when they seem to be taking the same level of responsibility or function within the organization. Yeah. So one of the key we get to see and read in the news is that when we look at financial sector or the banking sector in particular, there is only 20% of the women which are in the top positions. That means board positions or senior management positions. Now there's a gap which the human resources planning needs to pick up. And this gap is currently under scanner with the government and a lot of other organizations, because they say this leads to the gap or reward gap between men and women. Can you relate to that point?
Yes.
Okay. The third part is, third policy, principle that we look at is they have to have clear and transparent policies and procedures. These policies and procedures are normally published on the intranet, are given across in the employee handbook, and they are applicable to one and all working within the organization. Now, learning and development on behaviors is important because a lot of HR managers always look at understanding the requirements in terms of what is required and which skill is deficient, and they pick up on these behaviors to try and always put employees on training and the learning and development route so that they are able to better perform in their job roles and responsibilities. Fifth and sixth is obviously grievances or concerns or whistleblowing, as we call it in some of the organizations. The first department to come across that is the human resources department. So there are right policies in place, procedures in place to raise a complaint, make a complaint, things like that. And last but not the least, most places we expect HR and other leaders to also be a role model. That means management position, people in departmental head positions, they are seen as role models, within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And underneath that, what I've done is I've drawn up the ethical issues in HR, and these are also self-explanatory. Now, sometimes ethical issues in HR could be related to cash and compensation plans. That means in order for them to look at reducing the pay gap, what they have to do is they have to publish transparently the compensation plans for all employees at various levels. Not all employees, but for all levels. So you clearly know what is set for you in terms of reward at a manager level, at a assistant general manager level, at a general manager level, at a vice president level, and at a director level. Is that okay? These are things which cannot be hidden. So it's one of the ethical issues in terms of how to differentiate related to the job description and responsibility, higher responsibility, and also create that differentiation in terms of having, then the higher compensation or, incentive, higher role or responsibility within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Now, looking at, some of the, goals of effective HR management. Now, this is a set wherein what we typically look at is, HR services in particular, have been divided according to the delivery within the organization. Okay. Now, as we know that there are various, functions which the HR department actually works and takes care of within the organization. So when we look at, HR delivery in particular, we look at certain types of functions like some shared services. So let's look at, for example, HR services in particular. Now, what are the HR services you think of are there which the HR department provides?
HR business services. Sorry, HR business partners.
So, no, think of services which the HR department does. I've kind of named them a minute before, but just think of a few services which you think of the HR department does in particular, the key functions of HR department.
Policies and procedures.
Yeah, so they look at basically developing the policies and procedures within the organization, yes?
Yeah.
There could be payroll services which they look at. They look at employee benefits, which could include, schemes, reward management, pension, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Payroll is obviously your payroll processing, which happens at the end of the month, wage slips, and your salaries being done and all that. HR department also looks at training and development. They look at maybe career in some cases for senior managers. When a person has outgrown the post, but the organization does not want to lose that employee, they look at career planning and advice for that particular person to be able to create a role or, give additional responsibility. Training and development is one of the roles which HR looks at. Correct?
Yes.
So when you consider all these functions within that, there is a lot of things which the HR looks at in particular, from a point of view of, delivery, from a point of view of managing, various resources and making them work in tandem to be able to deliver things within the organization. So in terms of when we look at this in particular, you will see that in the center, I put together a model of HR delivery, which basically talks about three types of services in this case. And one of the services, shared services. Now, shared services could be that HR also provides, administration in some cases to certain other departments, right? So payroll could be done within accounts, but HR could also manage payroll. So on the payroll can actually be a part of HR as well as accounts department. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So that becomes a part of shared services. Now let's look at HR business partners. Now sometimes HR, what it does is it basically outsources the ability to be able to do training and development. Rather than have a training manager in-house, what they will tie up with a third-party organization which will maintain its training and development portal or look at offering training and development services to all the employees as and when the need arises within the organization. Have you seen that, or have you, experienced that?
Yes.
Yeah, and the last bit would be that in some cases, what tends to happen is the HR also expertise or, kind of expert advice options within or, kind of portal within the organization. Now, an example of this will be an intranet in particular. Now, there are lots of things which employees use on a daily basis which are related with HR department, things like letterhead, things like certain policies, things like job application form, things like basic things of raising queries. Now, some of these things could be developed as an intranet, which the HR can actually put into place, so that if they want to look at training and development, like for example, a new employee joins, then the manager or the person in HR does not need to do induction. They can be asked to go through an induction which has already been set on the intranet. Things like understanding policies and procedures, workplace environment, employee handbook, forms, bank forms, and things like that, could be set up as some sort of an expert center, which is nothing but a intranet.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So these are approaches and approaches of delivering HR services in a particular in a particular organization. There could be other approaches as well, but it gives you an idea that when human resources planning is to be done, and when HR has to respond to different needs or different types of needs within the organization, they can internally set up different departments which offer different types of services, or can be seen to be working with other departments to provide those services to the employees. Okay. Now, some of these delivery models have been, kind of firmed up over the years. Some of the agencies, which are specialist consulting firms like Deloitte, you look at KPMG, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, they've created different models over the years, and these models have also evolved in terms of their, framework and delivery. So the mid-90s models were slightly different. Then there was a different model in the 2000s, and this is kind of the current model, wherein it talks about, human resources, information requirement, which can be looked at, servicing from the HR department, but using taking the use of technology in particular. So it has firmed up as some sort of, a system which is called HRIS, which is Human Resources Management System or Human Resources Information System. Okay. So
Okay.
HR department does not need to be present everywhere. If you're working within a global organization, the key parts of the HR function could only be in the headquarters or in the main location of the office. But some of these services can still be provided using business partners, using employees within other departments which are based there permanently, or by setting up an expert center, through the route of the intranet, and that would then constitute something called the Human Resources Information System. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Coming to last few slides, looking at this is something which I'm going to send you but there are various, tools which are used by the HR in particular to evaluate, performance within the organization. One of the clear tools is called the Balance Scorecard. And Balance Scorecard is a tool which has come up over the years and has become a very important tool in understanding the performance of an employee or the organization in particular, in terms of that it is a performance matrix that is used, predominantly by management to identify and improve the internal functions of a business. And what they use is they use this technique to be able to forecast what could be the outcomes if these things are to move or the goalpost is moved with departments or different functions. And this can also be used to measure actually, and also measure and provide feedback to the organization. So I'm going to send you a handout on this. You'll have to read through the handout. And the idea is to understand that this is one of the key techniques which the HR department uses to evaluate, the factors which affect performance, and also basically the factors which actually affect the performance of an individual, and those factors could be internal or external. Is that okay?
Yeah.
The other technique that one of the other tool or technique that which HR does is basically an HR audit. An HR audit is basically nothing but a process or a method through which there is a current review of human resources policies and procedures is done in terms of looking at it holistically to revise them throughout the year. A simple example of this I will give you is that when you look at the Health and Safety or the Data Protection Act or the Health and Safety Act that we have, from the government in terms of law and legislation. These things have developed over the years, and every couple of years there's a revision of this which comes out, or an update of this which is brought out. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So if you imagine a policy within the organization, which is, say, for example, an equality and diversity policy. Now, last year or last year, the LGBT law was introduced, right? But most human resources department and human resources planning, when it is done, they have not incorporated the LGBT impact or the impact of that particular thing into their policies in terms of equality and diversity policy. So an HR audit is done in order to ensure that the processes and policies which are and the documentation in existence within the organization is reviewed on an annual basis to try and update it and meet the ever-changing requirements of rules, law, legislation, so that the documentation actually meets compliance set by the government. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah.
And then we look at the process of something called benchmarking. Now, benchmarking as a term can be used everywhere, applied in finance, sales, marketing, whatever it is. But benchmarking is, when we look at the definition in particular, it is nothing but the technique used to compare one business's performance, and when you benchmark that or compare it with the others in the market, which is compared to the best in the market. Okay?
Okay.
So benchmarking is nothing but if, say, for example, the Mercedes has to benchmark with the next best competitor in the market, they will not benchmark with Toyota. They will actually benchmark with BMW, right? So it is a technique or a process which is used within the HR department also to try and bench performance of one employee with the performance of other employees. So sometimes the HR will undertake a review wherein they will say, okay, in the performance appraisal, there are a number of sales managers. All the sales managers have a similar goal of achieving, say, 500,000 across the year for the turnover, but only 2 are able to achieve. So there's a benchmark which is done between why these individuals have been able to achieve as against the others which have not been able to achieve or have been able to overachieve. And this is used by HR to primarily look at doing comparison within the organization with the competition externally, identify the gap areas, identify how improvements can be done or which areas require improvement, and with those improvement process, try the approach of training and development to try and enhance the skills, and then again across the year or the next year again do the benchmark. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, so basically looking at a couple of other things wherein how the organizational performance is affected is this particular slide wherein it talks about there is a concept called human capital strategy. Have you heard about that?
I have heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
Right. Human capital, as a phrase or as a term was actually, kind of invented by economist called Gary Becker, Boris Becker, Gary Becker, right?
Yeah.
And he basically, invented this particular term because what he did was he referred to the knowledge or the kind of the knowledge which an employee has to be able to affect, the economic output of the organization. It's like saying that if you bring in or if you hire or if you bring in a particular person who has exceptional knowledge in that field or in that particular, sector, he or she will be able to kind of, one second, sorry. Just texting my missus. Sorry about that. So basically, what we look at in this case is that here a person who is hired brings a lot of knowledge, experience to the role, then is able to move, the organization in a very positive direction, in a very positive manner. Sorry, in a direction which help grow it rapidly in the organization and also in the market with respect to its competitors. So basically what he looked at was, in particular, looked at the kind of knowledge which the person is able to bring into the organization, along with these traits, these skills: leadership, value and culture, individual performance, is able to work within the, and then how is that individual able to affect the overall economic output within the organization. So sometimes when you look at human resources planning, when it is done, they look at recruiting the best out of the best in the market for a specific role, or a pivotal role as we call it. And that particular example is the mergers and acquisition department. So if you see people working within a department called M&A, they are considered very specific, very specialist in their roles, is because they've come or they have experience working within organizations which have undergone mergers and acquisitions. And when you look at employing somebody within that department, what they look at is, they do not look at the standard process of recruitment, but they look at the process from a point of view of experience and knowledge in that sector before they take that employee on. Okay?
Okay.
Now, in those cases, when you look at that potential of, the ability of the persons in terms of its contact, net, market understanding, dynamics, is able to bring across maybe a larger economic, turnaround in the company's position because of the traits which the individual exhibits. And that collectively is nothing but the capacity and the knowledge and the skill of his people, which then allows it to employ the best within the organization. Okay. Now, an example that I would try and give you is, say, for example, when we look at understanding, some of the global trends, that how people are valued within the organization. How do you peg that? Okay, if we hire an employee who's, say, for a particular department, in terms of, let's look at product development. You're hiring product managers. You would want to look at, hiring somebody who has prior experience, knowledge within that sector. So in that case, what you will look at is, you will then shortlist and create a list of certain key factors which are a must in the individual before the person is taken on board, as far as, recruitment is concerned. Some of these trends, when you look at, for example, some organizations, when they employ individuals, what they then look at is, if you say, pick up an example of Facebook. Now, traditionally, they will employ a lot of programmers, but they will employ a lot of programmers who have, an ability to think outside the box, which means they have the ability to be able to innovate or bring across creativity and innovation in product development, right? I think I'm not too sure, but when you look at just an example here, which I have seen and I normally quote, would be that Facebook introduced the concept of a timeline, a couple of years back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, a lot of users of Facebook were offended by the concept of introduction of the timeline, because it kind of segregated your posts and other things on the Facebook page. But over a point in time, this idea has been classified as a revolutionary idea, because it helps kind of manage the content being published on Facebook by the user and also by the publisher, in this case the company, Facebook, originally. They have introduced something which is a new concept, which is the Facebook market. Now again, a lot of opinion which was divided in the market was that they said that this is an idea they borrowed of Amazon and eBay, and they're trying to incorporate the marketplace so that they can increase revenues by looking at more of advertising and sales from the medium of internet sales like Amazon or eBay does. But again, that idea has now been looked at favorably in terms of acceptance with most of its audience on Facebook. Now, when somebody in that position would have been employed, they would have hired, what they would have looked at is that the person who came across, I don't know in terms of who came up, across with these ideas, and suggested these. But at some stage, they looked at hiring those employees from maybe competitor organizations or in general individuals which had this insight, creativity, and the ability to be able to think outside the box, which have kind of increased the human capital or the value of human capital within Facebook. As an organization, it is the most important asset within an organization like Facebook is nothing but people. As against when you look at a manufacturing organization or an engineering organization or a fast-moving consumer good organization wherein products and services are a key part. But in the case of Facebook, the most important asset which they look at is nothing but people, right?
Yeah.
So in those cases, what they look at is that, okay, if this is something to be enhanced, then the organization looks at making available all the possible resources which could help drive efficiency and output for the organization from that perspective. Okay? Okay. Now, last but not the least, one of the key things which we always look at is that every function within the organization has to align with the overall business strategy, right?
Yeah.
Now, if the management puts together some sort of a business plan, then all the other departments are given that business plan and they pick up the relevant components of the business plan and then adapt it to ensure that they are able to best meet the requirements for working on that plan. So from a human resources point of view, sometimes the HR department is also given the additional responsibility to kind of, detail out the strategic objectives into micro objectives for different departments and different employees in the organization. Now, an example of that would be that you normally get to see the chief executive and the board will actually plan what will be the sales strategy or, the sales targets which are set for the organization. But in order for those targets to be kind of disintegrated into smaller targets, that is done by the individual line manager or the department head, and then department head then sits with the HR department to start making those targets which are both qualitative and quantitative to fit into the job roles of the individuals.
Okay.
So an example here would be, in our case, a live example would be that when I look at the role of teaching and learning, what we do is we have seen that our teaching and learning, we need to cover level 4 and level 5 before you go to do your top up with university. But in order to ensure that you're progressing well in your studies, what we do is we break the topics down into individual modules and the individual modules into what you call the learning outcomes and the learning outcomes into individual learning plans. Now, from a perspective of planning, the principal and the quality manager would essentially plan out the courses. But when it comes to actual delivery, it's done by the quality manager sitting down with the tutor or the teacher to be able to ensure that the program is managed well, broken down into smaller parts, which still end up meeting the whole objective. Correct?
Okay. Yeah.
And then they sit down and understand in terms of what are the requirements and what is the capability of the tutor to be able to teach which modules. They understand what are the requirements for making sure that the delivery is effectively and it happens timely. And that is where the aligning of the entire program happens individually with each of the tutors, and then the tutor ends up delivering to the learners or the students. Okay? So basically, alignment of HR processes is done in tandem with the organizational objective is, and also from a point of view of understanding what is the capability within the employees or the employees base within the organization to meet that objective. And that is nothing but alignment of HR planning process with the business strategic objectives. And again, one of the tools and techniques that we use here to do is basically a balanced scorecard, for which I'm going to send you a handout, because a balanced scorecard helps you to clearly identify the key factors which are required for achieving that particular output, and it identifies the factors which affect it internally and the factors which affect it externally, so that you can better align the resources to achieve that organizational objective.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. And that, hopefully, along with two handouts which I emailed to you, will essentially give you some more details in terms of some of the aspects and tools and techniques like the balanced scorecard, the benchmarking, the HR audit, and the two models of change management that we've looked at.
Okay.
Okay. And next week, what we'll do is we'll start with the motivational theories just to cover this learning outcome off, and then move over to understanding the key features of resource management, which is physical resources, learning outcome 1.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, that's brilliant, Phil. Thanks so much for joining the session today, and I will catch up with you next week.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
No problem. You too. Thanks.